Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So a little while back, I did an episode on the biggest creatures in Magic. On this episode, I went through giant creatures with 11 power or more. There were, of course, incredible colossi, giant worms, and everyone's favorite Eldrazi. I, like many players in Magic, enjoy looking through and discussing some big and powerful cards. So, on today's episode, I'm going to be taking you through the biggest spells in Magic. Now, yes, rules lawyers out there, I know that technically every single thing outside of basically a land is a spell. So technically I've already talked about some of the biggest spells in Magic when I talked about the biggest creatures. But when I say spells for this episode's purposes, I'm talking about just instants and sorceries. Because, I mean, come on, if we're all going to be honest, the most spell-like card in Magic is definitely an instant or a sorcery. Also, for this episode's purposes, I of course am not going to be including X spells. Because on the stack, an X spell, yes, can have the highest converted mana cost. In fact, if you've got infinite mana, it's basically infinitely large. Although, rules lawyers again, yes, you have to choose a number. So for clarification's sake, let's just say converted mana cost in your hand is how we're determining the biggest instants and sorceries in Magic. And with all of that said, let's jump into it. So first off, let's start with the spells that have a converted mana cost of 9 mana. Again, when I said that we're going to be talking about big spells in this episode, I wasn't lying. 9 mana is a ton, but the effects are going to be well worth it from things like Rise of the Dark Realms, Plague Wind, and In Garruk's Wake. Rise of the Dark Realms is an absolute house in Commander. It's a sorcery that says put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control. In a format like Commander, this is a game-ending effect. Especially when paired with a board wipe or some milling, you're going to have a ton of creatures in the graveyard and you get all of them. And I should say, not just you're going to have creatures in the graveyard, but your opponent's creatures are coming into play under your control as well. So first off, you're getting all the ETBs from those creatures entering. And of course, in a game of Commander, there are a ton of incredibly powerful ETBs. And obviously, you're just going to have a giant army consisting of everyone's creatures that were in graveyards. So good luck to your opponents after you cast this massive spell. And like I just mentioned, Rise of the Dark Realms pairs incredibly well with board wipes such as Plague Wind and In Garruk's Wake. Both are one-sided board wipes that can really turn a game on its head. Plague Wind is a sorcery that says destroy all creatures you don't control that can't be regenerated. And In Garruk's Wake says destroy all creatures you don't control and all planeswalkers you don't control. Now regeneration isn't really all that common of a thing, but it is out there. So Plague Wind gets rid of all creatures and ensures that they're not going to stick around even if they regenerate. Whereas In Garruk's Wake doesn't deal with regenerating creatures, but it does deal with planeswalkers as well. Again, one-sided board wipes like these are easily worth the 9 mana that you're putting into them. They can wipe out your opponent's boards and keep your board completely intact. And I probably should have mentioned this before, but big spells such as these really have a home in a format like Commander. Again, it's a multiplayer format, so they have a much wider impact, and on top of that, you've got a lot more time to actually build up your resources. In other formats, getting to 9 mana is a lot tougher, but in a game like Commander, it's very doable. And in recent years, we've been seeing more and more high converted mana cost spells come out, such as Profane Transfusion and Skullstorm. Profane Transfusion comes from Commander Legends, and it's a sorcery that says 2 target players exchange life totals. You create an XX artifact creature token where X is the difference between those players' life totals. A life swap shenanigan like this one can be a lot of fun. If you're at a very low life total, you just take your life total and swap it with someone who's got the highest. And as an added benefit, the difference becomes a giant creature. Keep in mind that with this one, you don't even have to exchange your own life total. It can be any 2 players. So you can make a deal with the player that's got the lowest life total and exchange them with someone else. And in the process, you're still getting that giant creature. And then Skullstorm is a sorcery from the Commander Storm cycle that says whenever you cast a spell, copy for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. It says each opponent sacrifices a creature, each opponent who can't loses half their life rounded up. So if you've got a commander that you're going to be casting multiple times in a game, this can be a fantastic finisher. And actually a recent one that I highlighted in a few episodes, Awaken the Blood Avatar, is a great one for this. Okay, technically the commander is Exodus, but Awaken the Blood Avatar is the other half of that MDFC commander, and it's much more interesting, well, at least in my opinion. So you cast your commander a ton, then you cast your Skullstorm, and your opponents are very, very dead, most likely. Or at least they basically have no creatures and have lost a good amount of life as well. But next up, let's move on to some blue 9-mana spells, starting off with Expropriate. That's right, everyone's favorite Expropriate. If you've played Commander long enough, you've definitely lost to this card. It's a sorcery that says, Council's Dilemma, starting with you, each player votes for time or money. For each time vote, take an extra turn after this one. For each money vote, choose a permanent owned by the voter and gain control of it, exile Expropriate. A quick hint if you're on the other side of the table when this gets cast. Always choose money. The player that's casting this is going to choose time, so they get an extra turn. That doesn't mean that you and the other players should be giving that player extra turns. Now, most of the time, that player can still win the game by getting one extra turn in each player's best thing. But chances are going to be a lot higher if they get more extra turns and less things. And speaking of stealing your opponent's things, there's Clone Legion. I guess you're really not stealing things though, you're copying them, because it's a sorcery that says for each creature target player controls, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Regardless, this can also be a game-ending spell, but in a different way. If you're already in a solid position and you copy another player's entire board, you're going to be getting a ton of value. Again, if they've got some creatures with some very powerful ETBs, you're getting all those at once. And of course, you're adding to your army another giant army, which can easily help you win the game. And keep in mind that if you're in the best position and you have the best creatures on the board and maybe some really powerful ETBs, just target yourself. You're essentially just doubling up your own army, and yeah, you're in twice as good of a position. But next up, let's move on to Dichotomancy. It's a sorcery that says for each tap non-land permanent target player controls, search that player's library for a card with the same name as that permanent and put it into play under your control. Then that player shovels their library and it's got to spend 3 for 1 blue. So although this does cost 9 mana, we can suspend it for 3 mana and wait 3 turns. This can be a very powerful spell in certain formats when it goes off, but not really in Commander. In fact, unless you're playing against a Persistent Petitioners or Relentless Rats type deck, you're probably not getting any value out of this. Next up, there's the 9-Win, which is a sorcery that says search target player's library for up to 7 cards and exile them, then that player shuffles their library. So if your opponent only has a certain number of win conditions in their deck and they don't have any in their hand or in play already, you can just get rid of those and good luck winning the game from there. And then Mnemonic Deluge is another new one from Commander Legends that says exile target insert sorcery card from a graveyard, copy that card 3 times, you may cast the copies without paying their mana cost, exile Mnemonic Deluge. This is an incredibly powerful card that gives you basically 3 copies of whatever insert sorcery that you want from any graveyard. So if you can discard or mill an overpowered instant or sorcery, it's going to be game over when you cast this. You thought Expropriate was a problem? Well, how about 3 Expropriates? But next up, let's talk about a card that is so powerful that it is banned in a format like Commander. It's a sorcery that says exile all permanents, exile all cards from all hands and graveyards, each player's life total becomes 1. So basically, hey, let's reset everything. Well, I guess instead of resetting, we don't have hands, but everything is gone, and now everyone's life total is 1. Yeah, that's game ending. Especially in combination with something like, say, a suspended card that might deal damage, or even just a suspended creature that can come down and then start swinging. And if not, it's top deck time. Another game-ending spell, but for a completely different reason, is Dragonstorm. Dragonstorm is a sorcery that says search your library for a dragon permanent card and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library and it's got Storm. Now, getting 1 dragon can be incredibly powerful, but if you've been storming that turn, getting multiple can be game-ending. And of course, there are some incredibly powerful dragons with some incredibly powerful ETBs, so have fun with those. Next up, we've got a 9-mana spell that you're never going to be paying 9 mana for with Blasphemous Act. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield, and it's going to deal 13 damage to each creature. So in a format like Commander, this usually just costs 1 mana, and it's going to take out pretty much every creature. I mean, even in that biggest creatures episode, this takes out the vast majority of those. You know, except for the ones that have slightly more toughness and the ones that are indestructible, and you know what I mean. Regardless, for just 1 mana, yeah, that's incredibly impactful. And of course, since we're talking about red high mana spells, we've got even more ones that deal with damage like Soulfire Eruption, Volley of Boulders, and Searing Wind. Soulfire Eruption is a sorcery that says choose any number of target creatures, planeswalkers, and or players. For each of them, exile the top card of your library, then Soulfire Eruption deals damage equal to that card's converted mana cost to that permanent or player. You may play the exiled cards until the end of your next turn. So basically, pick your opponents, pick all their things, and start flipping your cards off the top of your library to deal a certain amount of damage to each one. With some other big spells in your deck and some lucky hits, you can take out a lot of things and potentially a player or two. And then Volume Boulders is a much simpler and a much smaller effect, to be honest. It says it deals 6 damage as you choose among any number of target creatures and or players. Now, 6 damage isn't really all that much, especially when you're dispersing that out. But you can get more value out of this for a cheaper cost when you flash it back. And then the final 9 mana red spell is Searing Wind. And actually, I believe that this is the first instant that we're talking about in this episode. It's a very simple spell that's going to deal 10 damage to our creature or player. Now, 10 damage to one thing for 9 mana is quite a bit, but instant speed makes it slightly better. Still, this isn't much in comparison to all the other game-ending cards that we've been talking about. And speaking of game-ending, let's talk about the Great Aurora. Or should I say, game continuing. It's a sorcery that says each player shuffles all cards from their hand and all permanents they own into their library. Then they draw that many cards. Each player may put any number of land cards from their hand onto the battlefield, exile the Great Aurora. So this card is somewhat similar to, say, a Worldfire, but very different in some ways. Basically, let's get rid of everything and draw a ton of cards and then put lands from our hand into play, and then we begin again. So if you've got a ton of things in play already and a lot of cards in your hand, you can come out on top comparatively to your opponents. But still, this is going to make your game take a lot longer. Next up, we've got some token producers with Crush of Worms and Feral Incarnation. Crush of Worms is going to give you 3/6/6 worms, and it's got flashback for 9 green. So if you thought 9 mana was a lot, that flashback cost is even more. Still, 18 power on the board for that cost is not all that bad. And then actually, Feral Incarnation I believe is our first uncommon that we're going to be talking about. It's a sorcery with Convoke, so your creatures can help you cast a spell, and it says put 3/3/3 green beast creature tokens onto the battlefield. So you probably won't be spending 9 mana to cast this, and you're getting 3 creatures with 9 power in total. And speaking of power, let's talk about Decree of Savagery. It's an instant that says put 4++1 counters on each creature you control, and it's got cycling for 4 green. When you cycle it, you're putting 4++1 counters on one target creature. So basically, you're permanently pumping your team by 4, or you're just pumping one creature for 4 and you're drawing a card. 9 mana is a lot, but keep in mind that you can do this at instant speed for a combat trick. And speaking of combat tricks, there's Vitalizing Wind, which is an instant that just gives all your creatures +7/+7 until end of turn. Now, +7/+7 is a ton, but unfortunately this doesn't also give trample. Still, this can work perfectly with certain commanders like the new Ruxa. And the final green card at this converted mana cost is Reshape the Earth. It says search your library for up to 10 land cards, put them onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. So although you are putting 9 mana into this, you are getting 10 lands into play. So next turn you can untap and you have effectively doubled up the amount of lands that you have in most situations. And if you don't win on that turn, well, I don't know what to tell you. And finally, let's talk about the white cards at 9 mana with Triumphant Reckoning, Blessed Wind, and Heroes Remembered. Triumphant Reckoning is a sorcery that says return all artifact, enchantment, and planeswalker cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is a one-sided mass reanimation that brings you back pretty much everything except for lands and creatures. So if you've got a deck built around artifacts, enchantments, or planeswalkers, well, you can have a lot of fun with that. And then we've got 2 cards that are, well, let's say less effective in a game like Commander, like Blessed Wind and Heroes Remembered. Blessed Wind says target player's life total becomes 20. In a typical format where you have 20 life, yes, this could bring you back up to your starting life total. In a format like Commander though, well, you're probably going to be using this on someone else. And then Heroes Remembered is a sorcery that says you gain 20 life and it's got to spend 10 for a white. Now, 10 turns is a lot to wait for this type of effect, and yeah, gaining 20 life in a format like Commander isn't all that impactful. But speaking of impactful, we've got some even bigger spells to talk about, so let's move on. So with a converted mana cost of 10, let's start off with the 2 cards, Curse of the Cabal and Dead Drop. Curse of the Cabal is a sorcery that says target player sacrifices half the permanents they control, rounded down, and it's got suspend 2 for 2 black. And at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if Curse of the Cabal is suspended, that player may sacrifice a permanent if they do put 2 time counters on Curse of the Cabal. So you can suspend this card to hopefully cast it for a lot cheaper, but if you do, your opponents can essentially delay that suspend. It will cost them a permanent for 2 counters, but that's going to be worth it most of the time instead of you making someone sacrifice half the permanents they control. And keep in mind that that is half the total permanents they control, which counts lands. So when you actually do cast this, you set one player back a ton. And then Dead Drop is a much less impactful card, and in fact it's an uncommon. It has Delve, target player sacrifices 2 creatures. So you can cast this for a lot cheaper, and in fact if you've got enough cards in your graveyard, you can cast this for just 1 mana. And while making one player sacrifice 2 creatures is nice, again, there are much more impactful things we can do at 10 mana. Speaking of which, let's talk about Eternal Dominion. Eternal Dominion says, search target opponent's library for an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card, put that card into play under your control, then that player shuffles their library. And it has epic. For the rest of the game, you can't play spells. At the beginning of each of your upkeeps, copy this spell except for its epic ability. You may choose a new target for the copy. So this is an incredibly impactful effect, being able to basically steal anything from your opponent's library and get it right into play. But it does come at somewhat of a cost because, you can't cast other spells. That being said, you do get the benefit of getting this over and over again on each of your turns. And actually, there are plenty of ways to use and abuse a card like this and have a really impactful deck, so if you haven't seen the episode on spicy decks, make sure you check that out. Basically, you're getting multiple copies of this and other epic spells multiple times in a turn. And while Eddie and I are talking about Alex's incredible deck on this and the other epic cards, we are also eating incredibly hot wings. So if you've always wanted to see me cry on camera, make sure you check that episode out. But next up, let's talk about some other 10 mana blue spells like Sway of the Stars and Time Stretch. Sway of the Stars is another one of those Worldfire-esque spells, so this one is also banned in Commander. It's a sorcery that says each player shovels their hand, graveyard, and permanents they own into their library, then draw 7 cards, each player's life total becomes 7. Basically, we restart the game and everyone's life total is 7. So yeah, resetting the game cards aren't always the most welcome thing in a game like Commander, so it's banned. And then Time Stretch is also incredibly powerful, but not banned, a sorcery that says target player takes 2 extra turns after this one. And like I mentioned before with Expropriate, that's probably going to be enough extra turns for you to win. You might not be stealing anything, but unlike Expropriate, you're guaranteed those 2 turns. But next up, let's move on to the 10 mana red spells with Apex of Power and Decree of Annihilation. Apex is a sorcery that says exile the top 7 cards of your library. Until end of turn, you may cast non-land cards exiled this way. And if this spell was cast from your hand, add 10 mana of any one color. So if you cast this from your hand, it essentially gives you all your mana back in whatever form that you want, and you are getting to cast things off the top of your library as well. And then Decree of Annihilation does something completely different. It says exile all artifacts, creatures, lands, graveyards, and hands from the game. And if you just want to cycle it for 5 red, you just destroy all lands. So again, like Worldfire, this basically resets the entire game, well, except for getting rid of enchantments, and it doesn't touch life totals. So it's not the most friendly of cards, but it's incredibly impactful. And keep in mind that cycling effect is really hard to stop. So instant speed, get rid of all lands, and I draw a card, yeah, that's pretty powerful. And speaking of powerful, there's Primal Surge. It's a sorcery that says exile the top card of your library. If it's a permanent card, you may put it onto the battlefield. If you do, repeat this process. Basically, if your entire library is permanents, congratulations, your entire library is now in play. And again, if you've got some powerful ETBs or a way to give haste, you can easily finish off the game right there. And finally, let's talk about the 2 white cards at 10 mana with Soul Scour and Stormherd. Soul Scour is a sorcery that says destroy all non-artifact permanents. Now, funny enough, I actually made a mistake with this one and initially including it in my Golos deck because I forgot that this also blows up lands. So make sure you keep that in mind. Regardless if you've got an all artifacts deck and you cast this, your opponent's things are pretty much all going to be gone and you've still got your artifacts in play, so you can probably win from there. And speaking of winning, there's Stormherd, which says create X/1/1 white Pegasus creature tokens with flying, where X is your life total. So yeah, getting an absurd amount of 1/1 flyers in play can easily help you finish out the game. Who said life gain wasn't powerful? Oh yeah, that's right, I did earlier. Okay, well you can win with it with something like this. But now that we've gone through all the 9 and 10 mana spells, there are still even bigger instants and sorceries out there. So let's just call this category 11 and up because there's only one 11 mana instant or sorcery, and that is Temporal Trespass. Temporal Trespass is a sorcery with Delve that says take an extra turn for this one, exile Temporal Trespass. So this is an extra turn spell that you can cast for the low cost of just 3 mana. Now you do need cards in your graveyard to exile to actually delve enough to make you cast it that way, but yeah, 3 mana for an extra turn spell is incredibly impactful. But next up, let's move on to a 12 mana spell with Volcanic Salvo. Volcanic Salvo's cost can also be reduced, but in a different way. It's going to cost X less to cast for X the total power among creatures you control. It's going to deal 6 damage to each of up to 2 target creatures and or planeswalkers. So for 12 mana, yeah, that's not all that great of an effect, but for 2 mana, yeah, that can be very impactful. But there's actually another 12 mana spell, and this one has no cost reduction, and that's Enter the Infinite. This is a card that truly lives up to its name. It's a sorcery that says draw cards equal to the number of cards in your library, then put a card from your hand on top of your library. You have no maximum hand size until your next turn. Basically, hey, draw your library, put one thing back in, there you go. If you can't win with your entire library, well then you probably shouldn't have cast this spell. But there is one spell on this list that costs even more than this. And actually, it's not even 13 mana, because there apparently aren't any 13 mana instants and sorceries out there for whatever reason. Which is actually kind of funny, because if you watch the Biggest Creatures episode, for some reason there are no creatures with 14 power. So as 13 is a problem for instants and sorceries, apparently 14 is a problem for creatures. Regardless, I'm getting off track, and I'm sure you want to see what the biggest spell in Magic is, and that is Blinkmoth Infusion. Blinkmoth Infusion is an instant. That's right, the biggest spell on this entire list. You can cast it instant speed. It has affinity for artifacts, and it says untap all artifacts. So although this card does cost 14 mana in total, you can cast it for 2. Now if you're casting this for 2, you can be getting an incredible amount of value by untapping all of your artifacts. That counts your artifact creatures, your mana rocks, etc, etc. So you can easily generate even more mana just by casting this spell. But if you're casting it for 14 mana, you're not getting any benefit out of it. And yes, in comparison to some of the other spells on this list, it's not nearly as powerful. But still, it takes the title of the biggest spell in Magic. Or yes, rules lawyers out there, I should clarify biggest instant or sorcery in Magic, because there are bigger technical spells in Magic, though again, like I talked about at the beginning of the episode, instants and sorceries are the most spell-like card. So while there are bigger creature spells out there, come on, those are creatures, and these are spells, right? Regardless, I really hope that you enjoyed this episode, because I had a lot of fun making it. And if I made any mistakes on it or I missed something, please let me know in the comments below. And again, keep in mind the rules for this episode: only instants and sorceries, and no X spells. I know that you can cast Torment of Hailfire for a lot, and when it's on the stack, sure, it's a 40 mana spell, but in this case, it doesn't count. Converted mana cost in your hand. And with that, the show has come to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.